I never thought a single day could break my whole life, but it did. I still remember standing inside my house that morning staring at the papers on the table. My hands were shaking like I had lost control of my own body. Sarah sat across from me like she already owned everything. I looked at her and said, "Sarah, what is this?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she leaned back, calm, too calm, and I felt something inside me tighten. Rehan stood behind her, arms crossed, smiling like he was watching a show. I forced my voice to stay steady. I said, "This is my house, Sarah." She finally looked at me and said coldly, "This house was never yours alone." Ayan, don't act like a victim. I felt my throat go dry as she said it like it was nothing at all. Rehan smirked behind her chair. I laughed, but it came out broken like glass hitting the floor. I pointed at the papers and said, "You really brought him here, Sarah? You really did this to me?" She didn't even blink. Rehan stepped forward and said carefully, "Watch your tone, man. This is not just your space anymore." I felt heat rise in my chest. I said, "Not my space, then what is it?" "Your hotel." She stood up slowly and said, "Ayan, don't make this ugly." I leaned forward and said, "Ugly? You already made it ugly when you signed everything behind my back." Sarah, her eyes finally flickered for a second, but she recovered fast. She said, "I had my reasons. You wouldn't understand." I snapped, "I understand perfectly. You chose him over everything we built." Rehan laughed lightly and said, "Don't act like a saint, man. Things change. People move on." I stepped closer and said, "Move on is not stealing everything I worked for." Sarah shouted, "Ayan, enough." I stopped for a second, her voice echoing in the room. I said quietly, "You think shouting will fix what you did?" She looked away for the first time. Rehan placed a hand on her shoulder like he owned her and said, "Let him talk. He is just emotional." I felt something snap inside me. I said, "Emotional? No, I am watching my life get taken, and you are calling it emotional." She whispered, "We are done, Ayan." I froze. Those words hit harder than anything. I said nothing for a moment, then I nodded slowly and said, "Yeah, I see that clearly now." Hamza grabbed my arm tightly and whispered, "Don't do something stupid, Ayan. We will handle this legally." I didn't look away from Sarah. I said, "This isn't over yet." Sarah's that night I went to my brother Hamza. I told him everything while he listened silently. Then he sighed and said, "I knew something was off, but I didn't expect this level of betrayal." I said, "She planned it, Hamza." He nodded slowly and said, "Yes, and we need proof, not anger." I punched the table and said, "I gave her everything. How do I prove that?" Hamza grabbed my shoulders and said, "Ayan, listen to me. Anger will not win this case." I looked away and said, "Then what will?" He said, "Truth and patience." I laughed bitterly and said, "Patience while she takes my house." Hamza said, "This is not just about the house, it is about your life." I sat down slowly and said, "I feel like I am losing myself." He said, "Then don't let her take that too." I nodded, but I was still burning inside. Then my phone rang. Unknown number. I answered and heard Sarah's voice. She said, "Ayan, we need to talk." I said, "We already did." She paused and said, "Rehan thinks you will drag this forever." I said, "I don't care what he thinks." She whispered, "Please don't make this worse." I said, "You made it worse the moment you chose him." She went silent and then said, "I didn't mean for it to be like this." I ended the call and stared at the wall, knowing nothing would ever be the same again. I felt completely alone that night. The next day I went to the house again. Sarah was there with Rehan arguing loudly about something. I walked in and said, "What now?" Rehan laughed and said, "Look who came back." Sarah looked tired and said, "Ayan, this is getting out of control." I said, "You think I am the problem?" She said, "I just want peace." I said, "Peace after destroying everything I worked for?" Rehan stepped closer and said, "Listen, man, just sign whatever you need and move on." I grabbed his collar and said, "Move on from my life." He pushed me back and said, "Don't touch me." Sarah screamed, "Stop, both of you." I stepped back and said, "You brought him into my house." She said, "It is not your house anymore." I said, "We will see about that." Then Hamza arrived and said, "Ayan, we got something." I turned and said what he handed me, documents showing Rehan's fraud deals. I looked at Sarah and said, "You chose a liar." She whispered, "I didn't know." I said, "You never asked." Hamza said, "We can use this in court." I felt something shift inside me. For the first time I wasn't just hurt, I was ready. Rehan looked nervous for the first time and said, "This is nothing." I smiled and said, "We will see about that." Sarah looked between us like she finally understood something was wrong, but it was already too late for her to fix it. That night I stayed awake thinking about everything Sarah had done and everything I had lost. Hamza sat beside me and said, "This is your chance, Ayan, don't waste it." I nodded and said, "I won't let her win again." He said, "Good, because this time we fight smart, not emotional." I looked at the papers and said, "Then let the truth speak for itself." House fell silent. After that conversation I felt like something inside me finally stopped breaking and started forming into something stronger. Sarah tried calling me Again, but I didn't answer. Hamza said she is panicking now. I said let her feel what she gave me. Rayhan disappeared from legal records slowly like he was never real. I knew then this was not just betrayal, it was karma. Sarah showed up one last time at my door and said, please Ayan, I have nowhere to go. I looked at her and said, you chose your path. She cried, but I felt nothing. I closed the door slowly and stood there listening to silence. Hamza came behind me and said, you okay? I said, yeah, I finally am. Because I lost everything I thought I had, but I found myself instead. He smiled and said, that is enough. I looked at the house and said, this is my life now. No more lies, no more betrayal, only truth. I walked inside and closed the door behind me, knowing I was finally free, and I promised myself I will never let anyone take my peace again, no matter what happens next. I said. I went to Bilal's office the next morning feeling like my chest was full of stones. He looked up from the papers and said, you came fast, Ayan. I sat down and said, just tell me the truth, Bilal. He sighed, opened the file, and pushed it toward me. He said, Ayan, this is bad. Her name is on the property papers too. My stomach dropped and I whispered, that's impossible. Bilal leaned back and said, in court only signatures matter, not emotions. I said, but I paid for everything, every single thing. He replied, you can't prove feelings, Ayan, only documents win cases. That sentence hit me harder than anything I had ever heard. I remembered Sarah telling me, sign this just in case we marry. I whispered, so she planned all of this. Bilal stayed silent and did not answer me. Later I walked outside the office feeling lost and empty. I saw Sarah and Rayhan standing near a black car laughing together. My heart stopped when she looked at me and smiled. It was not a warm smile, it was sharp and cold. Rayhan whispered something to her and she laughed again. I felt like I had already lost before the fight began. That night I could not sleep no matter what I tried. Hamza came into my room and said, you are shaking, Ayan. I said, I trusted her with everything, Hamza, everything. He sat beside me and said, trust is not proof in court. I laughed weakly and said, then what is my life even worth? Hamza replied, it is worth rebuilding, not destroying yourself over her. I turned away and said, she already destroyed it for me. Silence filled the room like a heavy wall between us. I realized nothing would ever feel the same again. Bilal called me back and said, Ayan, listen carefully. I said, I am listening, but I don't believe anything anymore. He said, you need to gather proof of payments and transfers. I replied, I have everything I built with my own hands. Bilal said, in law feelings don't matter, only ownership does. I clenched my fist and said, so love means nothing now. I remembered the day Sarah asked me to trust her completely. She had smiled and said, we are partners, Ayan, forever. I whispered, forever was a lie then. I went outside again and saw the same car still there. Sarah saw me again and this time she didn't smile. Rayhan said, you should leave this place, man, it is over. I said, this is not over until I say it is over. Sarah said, why are you doing this, Ayan, just let go. I said, let go of what you stole from me. She looked away and said nothing for a moment. Bilal texted me, Rayhan has multiple fraud cases pending. I said, so he was using her too. Hamza said, now you have leverage, use it wisely. I nodded and said, I will not make mistakes this time. Bilal said, we will file counter evidence tomorrow morning. I said, I want her to feel what I felt. Bilal said, be careful, revenge can blind you in court. I said, I am already blind from betrayal. That night I lay in bed staring at the ceiling again. My mind kept replaying Sarah's smile with Rayhan beside her. I whispered, how did I not see this coming? I said to myself, you trusted wrong, Ayan. Sleep never came no matter how hard I tried. The morning light felt heavy like it was judging me. Bilal called again and said, meet me at court tomorrow. I said, I will be there and I will not lose. I remembered Sarah saying, you will never survive without me. I said, watch me then. Her voice echoed in my head saying, this is my house too. I said, it was mine before your lies touched it. Bilal said, control your emotions in court, Ayan. I said, I will control everything except truth. I saw Sarah once more from distance standing alone now. She didn't smile this time, she just looked lost. I felt nothing but a quiet storm inside me. Hamza said, this is where everything changes for you. I said, it already changed the moment she betrayed me. Bilal said, tomorrow we expose everything. I said, good, I want the truth out. That night I finally understood something important about trust. I whispered, once broken it never returns the same. I closed my eyes and decided I would not be weak again. Her face kept flashing in my mind but weaker each time. Bilal said, court will decide everything tomorrow. I said, then I will let court hear my truth. Hamza said, I am with you no matter what happens. I said, that is all I needed to hear. I remembered Sarah saying, you are nothing without me. I said, I am everything without lies. My heart no longer felt broken, just focused and cold. Bilal said, bring all documents tomorrow without fail. I said, I will bring everything she tried to bury. I kept repeating in my head, I will not lose. The silence in my room felt different, like acceptance. I whispered, I am still here, I am still standing. I realized I was no longer the man who trusted blindly. I said, that version of me is gone forever. I closed my eyes and finally let the silence stay. Bilal said, we win this step by step. I said, I will take every step. I whispered, my loss became my beginning. I stood up slowly and looked at the dark room, feeling different than before. I said, Sarah, you lost me the moment you chose lies over love. I walked to the window and said, now I choose myself. I turned off the light and felt peace entering my chest for the first time since everything broke. I knew tomorrow would bring court battles, truth and pain, but I was ready because I was no longer the man who lost himself in love, betrayal, and lies anymore now. I started gathering everything I could without telling anyone. Receipts. Bank transfers. Old messages. Screenshots. Anything that proved I built that life. I sat on the floor of my room with my laptop open, scrolling like a man who refused to accept defeat. Hamza walked in and said, you haven't slept again? I didn't look up and said, sleep can wait. He sighed and said, Ayan, you're turning this into your whole life. I said, it already became my whole life the moment she stole it. He didn't reply after that. My phone rang in the evening. Unknown number. I answered. It was Mrs. Noreen from next door. Her voice was low, like she was scared. She said, Ayan Beta. I need to tell you something. I sat up and said, what is it? She hesitated and then said, I saw everything. She used to bring that new man even before leaving you. My grip tightened on the phone. I said slowly, you mean Rayhan? She said, yes Beta, many times. Late nights. While you were still here. My chest felt like it collapsed inward. I whispered, so I was replaced before I was even gone. She said softly, I am sorry Beta, I should have told you earlier. I said, no, thank you for telling me now. I hung up and sat there staring at the wall. Hamza came back and saw my face. He said, what happened? I said, she was already with him, before she even left me. Hamza clenched his jaw and said, that's betrayal on another level. I stood up suddenly and said, I need proof. Not emotions. Proof. He said, then stop letting it break you and start using it. That night I couldn't stay inside the house. I walked out alone. The street was quiet, but my mind was loud. Every step felt heavier than the last. I ended up at a small office near the market. Imran, the real estate broker, was still there working late. He looked up and said, "Ayan? You okay?" I sat down and said, "No. I am not." He studied me for a moment and said, "It's about Sarah, isn't it?" I nodded once. He sighed and said, "I heard what happened." I said, "Then you know I lost everything." Imran leaned back and said, "Not everything." "Not yet." I frowned and said, "What does that mean?" He opened a file and said, "If you prove financial dominance, you might get a stronger claim." I said, "Financial dominance?" He nodded and said, "Who paid most? Who maintained records? Who carried the loan burden?" I looked at him and said, "I did all of that." For the first time in days, something inside me shifted. Imran said, "Then you are not powerless." I whispered, "I feel powerless." He replied, "Feelings don't matter in court. Evidence does." Those words hit me differently this time. Not like Bilal's. This time they lit something inside me. Imran noticed it and said, "What changed in your expression?" I said, "Anger." He nodded slowly and said, "Good. Controlled anger wins cases." I leaned forward and said, "She thought I would break quietly." Imran said, "Most people do." I said, "I am not most people anymore." He smiled slightly and said, "Now you are thinking like someone who survives." I left his office with copies of documents he helped me organize. For the first time, I wasn't just collecting pain. I was collecting weapons. On my way home, I saw Sarah's house lights from a distance. It didn't feel like home anymore. It felt like a battlefield. Hamza was waiting outside when I got back. He said, "You look different." I said, "I feel different." He asked, "Better or worse?" I said, "Stronger." He nodded and said, "That's what I wanted to hear." That night I sat at my desk again. But I wasn't shaking this time. I was focused. I opened every file again and checked everything twice. Bank records. Transfers. Messages. Dates. Every piece of truth I had ignored before now felt sharp and clear. My phone buzzed. It was Sarah. I stared at the screen for a long time. Hamza said, "Don't answer it." But I did. I said, "What do you want?" Her voice was quieter than before. She said, "Ayan, we need to talk properly." I said, "We already did." "In court." She said, "Rayhan is not what you think." I laughed once and said, "He is exactly what I think." Silence. Then she said, "You're making this worse." I said, "No, Sarah. You made it worse the day you lied." Her voice broke slightly and she said, "I didn't lie. I cut her off and said, "You chose him over me. That is the truth." She didn't answer. I ended the call. Hamza looked at me and said, "That was new." I said, "What?" He said, "You didn't shake this time." I realized he was right. I wasn't trembling anymore. The pain was still there, but it wasn't controlling me. It was sharpening me. I whispered, "She thought I would disappear quietly." The court hearing started like a slow death I could feel in my chest before it even began. I walked inside and everything felt too quiet, too clean, too controlled, like my pain didn't belong here. Sarah entered a few minutes later wearing white. White. Like she was trying to look innocent on purpose. Rayhan walked beside her whispering something in her ear and she laughed softly like this was all some normal day for her. I clenched my fists so hard my nails dug into my palm. Hamza leaned in and whispered, "Don't react, Ayan." "Not here." I nodded, but I didn't feel calm. I felt watched. I felt judged. Bilal sat next to me and said quietly, "Remember. Speak only when needed." I said, I don't even know what I need anymore. He replied, justice. Focus on that. Sarah's lawyer stood first. He smiled like he already won and said, my client has suffered emotional distress in this relationship. I almost laughed out loud, but I held it in. He continued, the defendant is unstable, possessive, emotionally aggressive. I leaned forward and whispered, is he talking about me or a fictional villain? Hamza elbowed me lightly and said, stay quiet. Sarah didn't look at me even once. Not even once. Then her lawyer pointed toward me and said, he tried to control her life and isolate her from happiness. I whispered to Bilal, happiness? That's what they're calling betrayal now? Bilal said nothing, just kept watching. Then the judge said, we will hear from the plaintiff. Sarah stood up slowly. The room felt heavier the moment she did. She adjusted her white dress and looked at the judge instead of me. And then she spoke. She said, Ayaan was always emotional. I froze. She continued, I feared staying with him. I never felt safe. Safe. That word hit me harder than anything. I almost laughed, but it came out as a breath. I whispered under my breath, safe? In my own house? Hamza grabbed my arm tightly. Bilal leaned in and said, stay calm. Let the evidence speak. Sarah's voice got stronger as she continued. She said, he would get angry over small things. I felt trapped. I looked at her finally. For the first time she looked at me briefly but then looked away again like I was nothing. Like I didn't exist in her story anymore. Rayhan sat behind her smiling again like he was enjoying every word. I whispered, this is insane. Bilal said, your turn is coming. Sarah finished and sat down like she had just performed something rehearsed. Her lawyer nodded like he was proud. Then the judge looked at us and said, defense may present evidence. Bilal stood up immediately. He looked at me and said, ready? I said, I have been ready since day one. I stood up. My legs felt steady this time. Not shaking like before. I walked to the front holding a folder full of everything I had gathered. Every receipt. Every transfer. Every message. Every proof of survival. I placed it on the table and said, Your Honor, I paid for every part of that property. The courtroom shifted slightly. I continued, bank records. Loan payments. Renovation costs. All under my name. Sarah finally looked at me fully now. Not confident anymore. Just still. I opened the folder and submitted everything one by one. Bilal said, These are verified transactions over multiple years. The judge looked down at the documents. No reaction. No emotion. Just silence. I kept going. I said, she was added later under emotional trust. Not financial contribution. Sarah's lawyer stood up quickly and said, Objection. Emotional claims are irrelevant. Bilal replied, We are not arguing emotion. We are proving ownership. The judge raised a hand and said, Continue. Something strange started happening after the court hearing, and I noticed it before anyone else said a word. Sarah and Rayhan moved into the house temporarily like they owned a victory they never truly earned. But the house didn't feel the same. Even I felt it when I passed by it. It wasn't just walls anymore. It felt aware. Hamza noticed my silence and said, You keep staring at that place. I said, It's not the same house anymore. He frowned and said, What do you mean? I replied, It feels like it remembers. He gave me a strange look but didn't argue. The first sign came from the neighbors. Mrs. Noreen called me again one evening. Her voice was low like she was afraid someone might hear her. She said, Ayaan Beta, something is wrong there. I sat up and said, "What happened?" She hesitated and said, "People stopped visiting them. Even talking properly." I asked, "Sarah and Rayhan?" She said, "Yes. Everyone avoids that house now." I didn't respond right away. Then she added, "And electricity, it keeps failing." That caught my attention. I said, "Failing how?" She said, "Bills are high but lights flicker all the time. Appliances stop working." I leaned back slowly and said, "That doesn't make sense." She whispered, "Even water pressure is weak now. Like something is blocking it." I closed my eyes for a moment. Then I said, "Thank you for telling me." She said softly, "Beta, that house doesn't feel the same anymore." I didn't say anything after that. But I knew exactly what she meant. That night Hamza asked me again, "Why are you so quiet?" I said, "Because something is happening there." He said, "Like what?" I replied, "Like the house is rejecting them." He frowned and said, "Ayan, that's not possible." I looked at him and said, "Neither was everything she did to me." But it happened. He didn't answer after that. 2 days later, Imran called me. He said, "You might want to hear this." I said, "What now?" He replied, "Utility reports are showing irregular spikes and drops in usage." I said, "So it's not just talk?" He said, "No. Something is off with the property systems." I asked, "Can it be fixed?" He paused and said, "Technically yes, but it looks like repeated internal failures." I whispered, "Internal?" He said, "Yes. Like something inside is breaking it down." I didn't reply immediately. Then I said, "Let it continue." Imran said, "You want it to fail?" I said, "I want the truth to show itself." He didn't argue. But I could hear the concern in his voice. Meanwhile, Sarah started calling me more often. I didn't answer at first. But she kept trying. One night I finally picked up. Her voice came through immediately. It was not confident anymore. It was shaken. She said, "Ayan, please listen to me." I said, "I am listening." She said, "The house is falling apart." I stayed silent. She continued quickly, "Electricity is unstable. Water stopped twice today. Rayhan is trying to fix it but nothing works." I said calmly, "Then fix it." She hesitated and said, "We tried everything." I replied, "Then try harder." Her voice broke slightly and she said, "Can you come check it?" That stopped me for a second. I walked away from the noise in my house and said, "Why would I come?" She said, "Because you know that place better than anyone." I laughed once and said, "Now you remember that?" Silence. Then she said quietly, "Ayan, please." I closed my eyes. I remembered everything she did. Every smile. Every lie. Every signature. And I said, "You said it was yours." She whispered, "I didn't mean." I cut her off and said, "You did. You meant every part of it when you took it." She went silent. Not arguing. Not defending. Just silent. For the first time. I heard her without words. Then I said, "Fix your own house." And I ended the call. Hamza was watching me from across the room. He asked, "What did she want?" I said, "Help." He frowned and said, "And you gave none?" I said, "She gave me none when I needed it most." He nodded slowly and said, "Fair." Days passed and the reports kept getting worse. Imran said, "This is becoming unstable structurally." I said, "Let it be." He asked, "You're not worried about your property?" I said, "It stopped being just property the moment she turned it into a weapon." He looked at me carefully and said, "You've changed a lot." I said, "I had to." He replied, this level of detachment is dangerous. I said, no. This is clarity. That night Mrs. Noreen called again. She said, Ayan Beta, she looks scared now. I didn't respond. She added, even Rayhan is shouting at her now. Things are not good there. I closed my eyes and said, every action has a return. She whispered, you're not helping them, are you? I said, I am not hurting them either. She said softly, but something is happening. I replied, yes. She asked, what? I said, truth is settling in. Then I hung up. The next night Sarah called again. Her voice was almost broken. She said, Ayan, I can't sleep there anymore. I said, then leave. She said, I have nowhere to go. I paused. Then I said, that's not my responsibility. She whispered, I made a mistake. I said quietly, you made a choice. Silence. Long silence. Then she said something I didn't expect. I miss when it felt like home. I stayed quiet. Because I felt something shift inside me for the first time. Not anger. Not revenge. Just distance. I said, it stopped being home when you turned it into something else. She didn't respond. I heard her breathing on the other side. Then silence. Real silence. The kind that feels final. I slowly lowered the phone. Hamza asked, what happened? I said, she finally felt it. He said, felt what? I looked toward the direction of the house and said, what it feels like when something rejects you completely. And I knew then, the house wasn't just breaking around her. It was breaking her illusion too. It was late at night when I heard knocking, and I already knew before I opened the door that it wasn't going to be peaceful. Hamza was asleep in the next room, but I was still awake sitting in silence when it came again. Knock. Knock. I stood up slowly and walked to the door. When I opened it, I froze for a second. Sarah stood there. No makeup. No pride. No sharp smile. Just tired eyes that didn't look like the same person I once knew. She said softly, Ayan, I need to talk. I didn't step aside. I didn't invite her in. I just looked at her and said, it's late. She nodded quickly and said, I know, but I had nowhere else to go. My eyes stayed on her face. She looked different. Not stronger. Just lost. I said, Rayhan gone already? That hit her. She looked down and said, yes. I stayed silent. She shifted slightly and looked past me into the house. She said quietly, it's worse inside. I didn't react. She continued, everything is breaking. He left, and I'm alone there. I said, that was fast. She swallowed and said, I didn't expect it. I almost laughed but didn't. Instead I said, you never expected anything that actually happened. Her eyes flickered but she didn't argue. She took a small step forward and said, Ayan, I need help. I stayed where I was. She said again, softer, please. That word used to mean something. Now it felt empty. I asked, what kind of help? She hesitated. Then she said it. I want to come back. For a moment everything went quiet. Even the air felt heavier. I just looked at her. She quickly added, just until I figure things out. Just temporary. I nodded slowly like I was trying to understand something very simple. Then I said, you want to come back? She nodded quickly and said, yes. I have nowhere else. I looked past her for a moment into the street. Empty. Cold. Then I looked back at her and said quietly, that house, the same one you called yours? She froze slightly. I continued, The same one you laughed about in court? Her lips parted but no words came out. I stepped slightly closer to the doorframe but still didn't let her in. I said, "You called me emotional. You called me unstable. You stood in that courtroom and acted like I destroyed your life." She whispered, "Ayan. I was wrong." I said, "That's not the question." Her eyes lowered. I asked again, "Is this the same place you mocked me in?" Silence. No excuses. No lawyer speech. No Rayhan behind her. Just her standing there alone. She lowered her head completely. And for the first time since I knew her, Sarah had no words. I stayed quiet for a moment, watching her struggle with the silence she never gave me before. Then I said, "You don't want the house." She looked up quickly and said, "I do. I mean, I need somewhere." I cut her off calmly and said, "No. You want what you lost." That stopped her completely. I continued, "That's not the same thing." She whispered, "I lost everything." I said, "You chose everything." Her eyes filled but she didn't cry yet. She said, "Ayan. I didn't think it would end like this." I nodded slightly and said, "Neither did I." That hit her harder than anything else. She stepped back a little and said, "So what now? You just leave me like this?" I looked at her for a long moment. Then I said, "That's what you did first." She shook her head quickly and said, "No. I didn't leave you like this." I said, "You left me worse." Silence again. Heavy. Real. No one speaking over it. Just truth sitting between us. She whispered, "I made mistakes." I said, "No. You made decisions." That made her stop completely. Her hands trembled slightly now. She said, "I don't have anywhere to go." I said quietly, "That's not something I can fix." She looked at me like she expected something different. Like I would break. Like I would soften. But I didn't. Because I remembered everything. The court. The house. The laughter with Rayhan. The lies. All of it. She said again, softer, "Please, Ayan." I shook my head once. Not angry. Just final. I said, "You can't come back." Her breath hitched. She said, "Even for a few days?" I replied, "No." That word landed harder than anything else tonight. She stared at me like she couldn't believe it. Then she whispered, "You changed." I nodded slowly and said, "Yes." She asked, "Because of me?" I said, "Because of you and everything you taught me." That made her look down again. For a second she stood there like she didn't know what to do with herself. Then she said quietly, "Where do I go?" I answered honestly, "Not here." That was it. No shouting. No drama. Just truth. She stood there for a few seconds longer. Then she slowly stepped back. I didn't stop her. She looked at me one last time and said, "I never meant to destroy everything." I said, "Intent doesn't change outcome." She nodded slightly like she finally understood something. I didn't let her in that night, and I didn't regret it even for a second. Not out of hate. Not out of anger. But out of clarity. The kind of clarity that doesn't shake anymore. The kind that doesn't beg for explanations. Hamza stood behind me after she left the first time and said quietly, "That was really it, huh?" I nodded and said, "Yes." He asked, "You okay?" I said, strangely, "Yes." And I meant it. The next morning, Bilal called me. His voice was serious. He said, "Ayan, it's over for Rayhan." I sat up and said, "What happened?" He replied, "Fraud case confirmed. Multiple complaints." He's been arrested. I didn't speak for a moment. Then I said, so it finally caught him. Bilal said, it was already closing in. You just didn't see it earlier. I leaned back and said, I saw it. I just waited. He paused and said, and Sarah? I closed my eyes slightly. I said, she's collateral damage in her own choices. Bilal didn't argue. He just said, be careful. This doesn't erase emotional fallout. I replied, I know. But I also knew something else now. I wasn't inside that fallout anymore. That evening, Mrs. Noreen called me again. Her voice was softer this time. She said, Beta, she came back. I stayed silent. She continued, Sarah. She was crying outside the house. I said, and? She hesitated and said, she didn't come inside. Just stood there for a long time. I nodded slowly even though she couldn't see me. I said, that's good. Mrs. Noreen asked, good? I said, some lessons need distance. She didn't reply. Later that night, Sarah came again. One last time. I opened the door but didn't step outside fully. She stood there the same way she did before. But this time there was nothing left in her face except exhaustion. No pride. No arguments. No manipulation. Just emptiness mixed with regret. She said softly, this wasn't supposed to happen. I looked at her and said, neither was my betrayal. That line hung between us like a wall. She flinched slightly. She whispered, Ayan. I lost everything. I nodded and said, yes. You did. She looked at me like she expected comfort. Like the old version of me would appear again. But I stayed where I was. She said, I didn't think it would go this far. I replied, that's the problem. You never thought at all. That hit her harder than anything else. Her eyes filled instantly. She said, I made a mistake. I said, you made a decision. She shook her head and said, I didn't mean for it to destroy everything. I replied, intent doesn't change damage. Silence followed. Long. Heavy. Real. Then she whispered, what am I supposed to do now? I looked at her for a long moment. And for the first time, I didn't feel anger or pain. Just distance. I said, live with it. That made her cry fully now. No control. No pride left to hold it back. She covered her face and said, I'm sorry. I nodded once. But I didn't step forward. Because sorry doesn't rebuild what was intentionally broken. After a moment, she slowly stepped back. Like she finally understood there was nothing left here for her. She said quietly, you really won't forgive me.